And welcome, Hoosier fans, to this special live edition of the Assembly Call. Obviously, we're not following a game tonight, but decided to do this midweek edition of the show to break down the latest bracketology information that we have so that we all have a clear picture of what Indiana needs to do heading into the Big Ten tournament to make the big tournament, the big dance. And so we're going to talk about the latest bracketology. We have Andy Bottoms here, obviously one of the top bracketologists out there. He is going to break down his latest bracket, talk about what his current thoughts are about Indiana, the rest of the Big Ten teams, and then we will also look at the IU-Northwestern game, talk about what Indiana needs to do differently, some things they might try differently in this game based on some comments from Tom Crean that hopefully can bring about a better result. So if you are listening live, we thank you for being here. And we also want to thank everybody who is listening on the podcast, on Podcast on the Brink. Obviously, I've been hosting Podcast on the Brink for 2 years now, and so I'm excited about this opportunity to bring our show over to you. We are recording this live on Tuesday night at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. But if you're listening to this probably on Wednesday or maybe on Thursday, you're getting the recorded edition. But I wanted to bring you Andy and Ryan. This is our normal crew for the post-game show. We go live, of course, after every IU game at assemblycall.com/live with this very format, just three friends talking IU basketball, and that is what we are going to do tonight. So with that said, let's dive right into the bracketology stuff. Andy, your latest bracket came out today, and you have Indiana currently playing in Dayton. You have them playing against Temple, which will make everybody shudder after what happened in 2013 when Temple almost beat us in the second round. But if you would real quick, just kind of go through the thought process, because obviously where Indiana is, are they in, are they out, has been a big topic of conversation. What ultimately led to you putting them in the field right now?
I think at this point for me, they still have enough good wins that they compare favorably to other bubble teams. Now, at some point, those wins are getting to be pretty far in the rearview mirror, and I think that's obviously the part where everybody starts to get concerned. I mean, when you look back at the schedule, the last quote-unquote good win they had was the Maryland game, which was January 22nd. That feels like an awfully long time ago, as we can all attest. So, 4-8 since then. And while the committee has said I'm not sure when this happened, at least in the last few years, it seems like they said, we don't pay specific attention to the last 10, the last 12 games. It's really the total body of work. I do think in something that's as subjective as the tournament, at least in parts, I mean, the numbers are what they are, but at some point you're interpreting those numbers as a committee however you want to, and so I think subconsciously it kind of creeps in, and the eye test comes into play and all those kinds of questions. So I think if you look at you want to look at positives for IU, they've got 3 top 25 wins, which is something that really no other team right around where they are in the bubble can compete with. There's a couple that have 2, but a lot of the teams in that area have none or just 1. They've got 4 top 50 wins. They've got 8 top 100 wins. So I think those things are positive. The issues as you look at those are, again, recent performance, I think, is a question mark. The road and neutral court record is a big one. They're 4-8 overall away from home. The Butler game is and winning at Illinois are the ones that really matter. But other than that, they won at Rutgers and at Nebraska, a game that we all thought early on would be a lot better than it turned out to be. And when you look at who their Big Ten wins came against, I think you and Alex mentioned this on the last podcast on the Brink episode, is that they've got 9 conference wins, but just 2 of those came against teams that were over 500. So as you start to look at what have you done for me lately, it isn't a whole lot, as we can all commiserate and talk about at length. And so I think that's where you start to balance out those factors, and it really pushes them a lot closer to the bubble than we would have guessed, even a few weeks ago.
So you were very coy in your write-up. You said Indiana will have a chance to avenge its lone sub-100 loss when they take on Northwestern Thursday. A loss there would likely be the final nail in the coffin, while a win would set up an important matchup with Maryland. And you left everybody hanging, because what everybody wants to know is, if we beat Northwestern, are we in? So what do you think? Are we in if we beat Northwestern, or do we need to then go on and beat Maryland as well?
That's what gets tough about this is this is probably not the answer everybody wants to hear, but it is all relative. I mean, what you're doing here is comparing what IU has done and is doing to other teams that are around where they are. And so I don't think, I guess I look at it this way. I think there's a kind of a couple extremes, if you will. So one is losing to Northwestern. I think they end up being out. If you beat Northwestern and you beat Maryland, I think you're almost certainly in. I really have a hard time coming up with a scenario there that where they would miss out again. That would give them a fourth top 25 win, and show some signs of life late in the season. I think it's that middle ground that gets interesting, and I don't think there's a definitive answer for that. I think part of it then gets back a little bit to that eye test in terms of how do they look doing it. If they squeak out a win against Northwestern and they get their doors blown off against Maryland, which seems unlikely based on the way IU's played Maryland this season, then it's probably a little bit different story of, do you beat Northwestern by 8-10 points, and do you play Maryland down to the wire as you did there? I think, even had they lost some of these other games, you think back to the Iowa game, had they lost that game in a similar way to the Michigan State one, where it's a little bit closer and a bit more competitive even by the end, at this point, I think people are looking for reasons to put IU out because they've played so badly, and I think they have to give reasons to put them in. And some of that is by simply winning, but some of it is also by the way they play. So I still didn't answer your question because I honestly don't know that that's an easy thing to do. It feels like every year there's a team or two on the bubble that gets on a run. I think NC State was one of those teams last year that was, kind of an odd selection. They ended up playing really well, but they played very well in the ACC tournament and really jumped a few teams. So, does a UCLA do something like that in the Pac-12 tournament? Does Texas A&M do something similar in the SEC tournament, which I know would clearly cause a rift in your house if that was to take IU out of the picture? So there's some of those kinds of things. Does Texas play really well? The BYU Gonzaga game is pretty important tonight from that standpoint. So there's just a lot of moving pieces around where IU is, and so that's why it's not necessarily an easy question to answer.
Yeah, so I mean, would it be worthwhile for IU fans to kind of start adopting some other teams and watching some other teams, I guess, hoping that they lose? I mean, is this where you start looking at the last four in and the first five out and just hoping the others drop like flies so that maybe just by default you're kind of left standing at the end?
Yeah, it doesn't hurt because I think in that case, if some of those teams lose, so if like a Temple goes out early in the American Conference, if BYU gets blown out tonight, if Texas loses early, Texas A&M, Illinois, another Big Ten team to kind of toss out. If those kinds of teams lose, they're probably going to lose. If they lose their first game, it's going to be to somebody who isn't very good, and it's really going to hurt them from a bad loss perspective. Versus IU beats Northwestern and plays well, then I think that definitely helps. There aren't nearly as many kind of bid thieves to talk about. I know Northern Iowa and Illinois State was one. I touched on Twitter over the weekend where, that was a good thing for IU fans if you want to think of it that way, that Northern Iowa won and, a bid didn't get taken away. But there really aren't a lot of those because most of the kind of highest rated mid-major teams have already played. I know Murray State got some conversation on Saturday. Iona lost last night, but they really don't have quite the resume. Wofford's another one that's been seeded pretty high that won. I think if I think of others that are out there, like Stephen F. Austin would be one to root for. I think they're kind of a long shot, but they haven't lost hardly any games, and even though they don't play in a good league, so root for them to win the Southland. Valparaiso and Green Bay play tonight. I think either of those teams could give somebody trouble, but I'm not sure either of them has the resume to get in on their own. So those are at least a couple of the ones now, but I think there's less of that than there has been. Now, obviously, could somebody come out of nowhere and say the Mountain West and get up there? I suppose that's possible, but seems like there's fewer of those bullets to dodge this year than in most, so I think that does help at least a little bit.
So I want to get into a few of the matchups that you have here in this bracket, and obviously these matchups are far from written in stone, but I think there's some interesting ones, potential matchups based on some seedings. Before we get to that, I want to ask you kind of about your process because the whole bracketology process is totally foreign to me. And I was listening to Dokic's radio show today, and he had the AD of Michigan State on, who I believe is the committee chair, or at least he's on the committee. And they were talking about some of the criteria that they use, and it had always seemed to me like the criteria was a little bit more fixed in the past. Like I may be wrong in this, but I was always under the impression that if you lost a game early in the season and the team had an injury, they didn't necessarily count that injury against you, like Indiana playing without or beating SMU without Marcus Kennedy, right? But from kind of what they were talking about today, those kind of things maybe are factored in. And the last 10 games is no longer an official part of the criteria, but it kind of is because people can kind of make up their mind on their own. So with it seeming to me like it's more of a moving target, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe it's always been that much of a moving target, how do you go about trying to hit the bullseye on the dartboard when it's moving so much, or seems to be moving so much?
I try not to. I don't know. I try to follow at least a similar process each time. I do think there are different times. I think Galen at Crimson Cast mentioned this today. He released one and said, it'll be interesting to see what this incarnation of the committee values the most, whether it's top 50 wins or record away from home or how you tried to schedule, how you played late in the season, because it is a different group of people each year, and I think you're prone to getting either groups who by persuasion or otherwise end up valuing certain things a little bit more than they might have in years past. So to some extent, I don't know that there's any way to really control for that. So in my head, I try to just balance it out a little bit. I just have a spreadsheet. I pull in a bunch of the numbers and built some things in there to compare teams side by side and kind of take goods and the bads, and you're kind of putting tick marks in different columns at certain points, whether teams have played well away from home and they've played well late in the season. They have a winning record against the top 50. Do they have a winning record against the top 100? Some of the strength of schedule pieces and things like that. But it is kind of nebulous when you really think about what everybody's trying to do, because they do have guiding principles, and the whole last 10 games thing is one that comes up a lot. But at the same time, you got humans in there where it's hard not to take some of those things into account, whether consciously or subconsciously. So it definitely isn't easy, but I don't know that over the past few years, I think I've probably made a few enhancements to the spreadsheet that I use, which sounds super nerdy, obviously, but other than that, I like to think I haven't changed too much. I mean, you might bring other factors into play, some of the Pomeroy stuff. I mean, that's another one where they say that's not really taken into account, but it's available there. And some of the things I always think it's interesting. You read some of the mock selection committee this year, and kind of what people walked away thinking that top 50 wins are really important. I remember I read somebody's, but how those different things are used. So like it or not, RPI is a factor. That's really the way that they organize all the wins and losses of the team. So that plays into it a bit as well. And sometimes you're just like anything else. Luck is a part of it, that you might have just a feeling about a certain team and put them someplace, and that ends up being right. And there's other times where, like Oregon a couple years ago, that I think everybody missed by 2 or 3 seed lines based on whatever it is that they were looking at. So I think you kind of follow the same process year after year. You're probably going to end up getting pretty similar results, even though you got different people. You're going to be right on some, you're going to be wrong on some. You try to be kind of at least around where the committee would have them. But there's definitely a lot of factors that might vary it from one year to the next, and I don't know if there's really a way to control for or predict that.
So you don't necessarily listen to what the committee members are saying in media interviews and necessarily let that influence you, or do you do it all? I mean, if you hear one guy maybe on the radio talking about how maybe we are looking at last 10 a little bit, or maybe we are looking at Ken Pom a little bit, do you let that influence you, or is it, for you at least, try to be pretty consistent from year to year?
I try to be pretty consistent. I do think there are times, especially as you get into the weekend, when they're a little bit more into the seeding process, where they have these guys on for different interviews, and you can try to listen to those and pick up little things that might give you an inclination one way or the other. But I don't let it influence too much. But there are definitely some things you can interpret the way that they say them as it gets a little bit closer, when they don't really do the seeding process till the weekend. So the selection piece, I don't know that that's a much of a factor at all. Comes into play a little bit more with the seeding. So I honestly haven't listened too much to any interviews that they've done with them this year at this point, but probably something that will be more prevalent over the course of the weekend. So probably by the very nature of that, I'll end up paying a little bit more attention to it at that point.
All right, so here's a question for you, Bottoms. You're obviously number one right now in Bracket Matrix, and they have their whole ranking system for how they do it. And you've submitted a bracket to them 3 years running, and you have the number one ranking, which we're all very proud of, and you should be too, because you do a great job and you work really hard at it. So, knowing that you take this very seriously and you're very proud of it, let's say, hypothetically, that your final bracket has Indiana on the outside looking in. On Selection Sunday, will you be rooting for Indiana to be out to protect the integrity of your bracket, or will you be rooting for the Hoosiers to be in, your bracket be damned? Where does your loyalty lie?
I would definitely be rooting for IU to get in there. That's not even a question.
I know. I just wanted to ask, just to make sure everybody knew where your loyalty was. Okay.
This could have ended abruptly had I not answered that correctly, I'm sure.
Yeah. All right, so here's something that I guess was kind of a shock to me, and maybe I should have realized this more, but the committee really does place an emphasis on geography, and even more so than I thought. I really thought that, this kind of S-curve that they've talked about, I really thought they did try and rank, especially the top 4 seeds, and put the number one seed with the 4th number 2 seed and kind of go like that. But it really sounds like they don't. And again, correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like they slot the seeds, the 4-1s, the 4-2s, the 4-3s, and the 4-4s, and then it's based on geography where you go, meaning Kentucky obviously will be the top number 1 seed. Wisconsin, if they're not a number 1, will likely be the top number 2 seed, but they could be placed in the same bracket. I believe Cleveland is the closest one. They both could go there, as opposed to maybe sending Wisconsin out west, with the thinking being that there will be greater fan travel to the closer arena, which I suppose I get, but then you also get this potentially great Final Four championship game matchup of Kentucky and Wisconsin that ends up being a round of 8 matchup instead. So number one, how much does the geography play into it? And number 2, do you agree with that, or would you rather see it be more, kind of set up so that the top number 1 seed gets a little bit of a bonus with a seemingly easier draw and kind of go that way, which is what I always thought it was, frankly.
Yeah, they've gone to this I feel like I don't have a very good handle on the time frames that they've done this, but I know it's been more recent that they've gone this route, and that's definitely the way that it would go. And a lot of people have already started a campaign, complain, whatever you want to say about Wisconsin being in with Kentucky, but that's the most likely scenario at this point if Wisconsin doesn't get a 1. And I think it really plays a bigger factor as you're in on those first couple seed lines, because once you get into even the 3s, is a good example for this year of, there are rules around where teams from the same conference can be placed if they're on the top 4 seed line. So for this year, as an example, the top 8 seeds are, in some order, pretty much locked down to be Kentucky, Virginia, Duke, Villanova, Wisconsin, Kansas, Gonzaga, and Arizona. Maybe Gonzaga, if they lose, tonight to BYU, could fall out of that, and maybe Kansas, with an early exit, maybe they could. But let's assume those are the top 8 for now. Well, in that case, I have Maryland, Notre Dame, Iowa State, and Oklahoma. So if you look at that, Iowa State and Oklahoma, while they be geographically closer to some of the places in the Midwest, they can't be in the same places. They can't be in the same region as Kansas. And then you've also got Notre Dame, who can't be in the same region as Virginia. Well, that pretty much leaves Maryland as the only team that can be in that region with Kansas and Virginia. So just as one example, the geography is pretty important for the first couple seed lines, but there are other things that can override that a little bit as you go. As far as whether I like it or not, I'm sure buried somewhere in the thought process to do that is some kind of farce around the NCAA really caring about student athletes and not making them travel as far and all that. So I'm sure that's clearly the student athlete's best interest is always at heart there. So I hate to rail against that. I did kind of like the other way, and I think it's easy to answer that from a competitive standpoint. Now, if I'm a fan and I have to go to Los Angeles instead of Cleveland, and I'm in Wisconsin, then I'm A, probably less likely to make that trip, and B, I'm not that happy about it if I do. Although I guess if you're from Wisconsin and you can go to LA in March, maybe not that bad. But conceptually, as just a fan of the game, I would rather see it a different way. But I do think there are legitimate reasons for doing it, but I did kind of like the other way where they did more of the S-curve. And even within that, you got into some of these same scenarios with different conferences and things like that and where you can place teams. So I think they try to balance that out a little bit. I think at the end, they go up and add kind of the true seeds. So when they rank the teams from 1 to 68, they add up what it looks like in each region to try to get a feel for whether they're balanced or not. But I think in cases like this, you might balance that out later down the line and have some of the lower other seeds. But if you just look at a top 4 seed type range or a top 2 seed, you're pretty likely to end up with that, because I'm not really. I think if Wisconsin ran the table in the Big Ten, they could certainly get it, but their resume isn't quite as good as Villanova's, and they've also got to leapfrog. If they don't leapfrog Villanova, they've got to leapfrog one at Virginia or Duke, which I think is pretty tough as well. So I think they could get there, but I think at least at this point, the more likely scenario is they do end up where Kentucky is, and everybody complains about that. But the IU fan part of me is not hurt by the fact that Kentucky's road might get a little bit harder. So I'm sure that is a view shared by many listeners at this point. So from a basketball standpoint, I'd probably like to see it bounce the other way, but I do understand the reasoning for it, and it's definitely something that I try to factor in, at least as you get through the first few seed lines. But after that, it can be a little bit tougher, with trying to keep some of the conference affiliations apart.
Yeah, my big hope is that Michigan State is an 8 or a 9 seed opposite Kentucky, because I think, 40 minutes, Michigan State's at least got the size and physicality and experienced guard play to tough out a win against Kentucky. So, Andy, on the off chance that the committee just decides to go to St. Elmo's every night in Indianapolis and not take it so seriously and just pluck the number 1 bracket off Bracket Matrix as the final one, do you think you can make sure that Kentucky has the toughest road possible, just in case they steal your bracket as the official one?
I'll do my best.
So we're waiting on Ryan to come. Ryan seems to be having some quote-unquote technical difficulties. Has anybody checked to see if the Chargers made a big free agent signing? Because maybe that would explain Ryan's computer problems. Just kidding, Ryan. We love you. Hopefully you can get in here. All right, so Andy, let's talk about some Big Ten teams here real quick. We covered Indiana. I think we understand what the Hoosiers need to do. You need to beat Northwestern, and then if we do, on the post-game show after the Northwestern game, we can kind of reassess it, see where everything stands, see where we are heading into the Maryland game. As for other Big Ten teams, it seems like the only other two, well, let's talk about Ohio State, Purdue, and Illinois, because they seem to be the ones that are the most tenuous, although you have Ohio State, Andy, as a 9 seed, which I suppose is somewhat surprising given their just horrible non-conference strength of schedule, and they just look terrible against Wisconsin recently, but they've racked up some wins. But Purdue sitting as an 11 is surprising to me, and I see people wondering if Purdue's in, and I haven't studied this very much, but that seems crazy to me for a team that went 12-6 and really looked good at times in the conference, and certainly looked good against Indiana for 80 minutes this year. How close are they to being out? I mean, 11, that doesn't exactly seem secure, but I have to think that they have to be feeling pretty solidly about their chances to be in.
Yeah, they're a good test of a lot of the things that we talked about. I mean, when you look at what they did in the non-conference, their strength of schedule wasn't that great, and they lost to Kansas State, which has been kind of a roller coaster. At times look good, at times look bad over the course of the year. But that kind of right now, when you look at it, is considered a quote-unquote bad loss. They lost at home to North Florida, who ended up getting in the tournament, but again, from an RPI perspective, not a good loss. They lost at Vanderbilt, and they lost to Gardner-Webb at home. So they've got 4 pretty, 2 really ugly losses, and a couple that are in that middle ground where they're major conference teams, but they're not really the better teams from those leagues. So I think those are things that play against them. I think the things that play well for them are they've got 4 top 50 wins. So they've got a non-conference win over BYU. They've got one over NC State. So those are a couple of nice out of league wins to have. They swept IU. They've beaten Iowa and Ohio State at home. Outside of the IU game, they haven't done a lot of damage on the road. They've lost a lot of road games, but they've in conference play at least won most of the ones they were supposed to. They did lose at Minnesota in a game that they were up in and lost, but they're 9-9 against the top 100, and if you look again at that last 10 games, piece of the equation, they're 7-3 in those games, and I think have played really well. And they certainly, when you look at them and watch them play, defensively they seem to get better. They've got the 2 big guys inside, and really seem to be peaking at the right time. So I guess I am one who falls in the category of thinking they're pretty safely in, and even in the Big Ten tournament, I think whoever their likely opponent would be, I think they're the 3rd seed, which would. Maybe that may not actually be true. They might be the 4th seed. I don't know. I'm a little not sure on where they would play. So they might play like an Iowa or Ohio State in the in what will be their first game after the double bye. And I don't think either of those would be, to me, a bad enough loss to push them out of the field. So to me, the only argument against them is hey, you lost a bunch of games in November and December that you maybe shouldn't have lost, but since then, I think they've really been pretty solid, and I would have a hard time thinking that they're not one of the better teams in the country based on how they're playing right now. Now, if they don't make it, and that really falls into the it's really everything you've done, whole body of work. These last 10 games don't matter. Then that probably bodes well for IU. But at this point, I don't have. They're probably a couple spots away from that first four to me, which says they're in pretty much regardless of what happens.
Yeah, Purdue's the 4 seed. They will play the winner of Iowa against Penn State or Nebraska in the in the quarterfinals of the Big Ten tournament. Hey, I wanted to ask you this question earlier. And by the way, if you're just joining us, we spent about the first 15, 20 minutes talking about Indiana and where they are, what they need to do. So feel free to start watching from the beginning, or certainly you can watch the archived version of this video at assemblycall.com/live at any point over the next few days. One quick question for you, Andy, that I forgot to ask earlier is two of Indiana's biggest wins are against SMU and the road win against Illinois. SMU didn't have Marcus Kennedy. Illinois didn't have Rayvonte Rice. Which, when you think about it, Indiana sitting at 19-12, both those games were close. You have to think maybe those games go differently if SMU and Illinois had those two players, and then Indiana's sitting at 17-14, which is actually the same record they carried into last year's Big Ten tournament. So I guess that kind of puts it in perspective. But will that come up in the conversation with the committee, you think? I mean, will they say, hey, so here are these two big wins Indiana's hanging their hats on, and yet Kennedy and Rayvonte Rice didn't play, so maybe we discount those a little bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the Kennedy one, to me, maybe is a little bit more impactful. I've heard conflicting things that in some ways that doesn't matter, and in other ways so you beat who you beat, and in other ways they do take some of that into consideration. So I do think that in some ways becomes a lot to manage if you're the committee and trying to remember all those things. I think it's a little bit easier if you're looking at, SMU and where to put them and saying, oh, well, they lost these games when he wasn't there. But do you push that forward to every other team and take the time to sort through that? I really don't know. The reason I say it matters less for the Illinois game is, other games that Rayvonte Rice didn't play are some of their better wins of the season. They beat Maryland without him, they beat Purdue without him, and they beat Michigan State without him. And the Michigan State one was on the road, as I recall. So in that case, to me, that matters a little bit less because they showed they could beat teams without him that were of a high quality, and had beaten Maryland just a couple games before IU played them. So that one to me is a little bit less impactful, by comparison of the two. So I think it factors in a little bit, but I don't know that it's a huge deduction, if you will, for IU.
What does Illinois have to do to get in, you think?
I think they've got to win at least a couple, because their first game of the tournament is not against I think they play Michigan, who that's not really going to move the needle one way or another for them. And at that point, they'd have to play Wisconsin, and they just got throttled at Wisconsin not that long ago. So I think they're in a bit of trouble. They're a little bit like IU in the sense that they have a few good wins that look impressive. They've had a lot of different roster issues, including the Rayvonte Rice and other things over the course of the season. But they're 5-10 against the top 50. I think they're trying to keep track on this sheet here where they are, what they've done against the top 100. So they've done a few good things, but they also have they're 5-11 against the top 100. Sorry about that. They're 3-6 against the top 50. They've got one sub 100 loss. They lost to Miami, who's another bubble team, which doesn't really play in their favor. They lost at Michigan, although that was when Michigan was at full strength. They lost in Nebraska. They lost at Minnesota. So those aren't not horrific, but they're not great either. And so their non-conference strength of schedule is not very good. And they've so I think they're in a little bit of a tough spot. I mean, they're 2-5 against teams between 51 and 100. So I think that really hurts. Those aren't maybe not bad losses in the sense of you lost to sub 100, sub 200 teams, but it's also kind of fringe tournament teams that you really didn't perform that well against. So I think that becomes problematic, and I think for them, they end up needing to win a couple games to get in because the Michigan one, it gives them another top 100 win, but doesn't really do much else. So I think a pretty tall order for them, and one they probably end up coming up short in, as I really don't see them being able to beat Wisconsin.
All right, so here's a two-part question for you. Number one, I think I know the answer to, but I just want to get clarification on it. As you go through this bracket, are you more seeding the teams where you think they should be, or are you more trying to predict what the committee will do and what will come out on Selection Sunday?
I try to do. It's hard to balance both because at least if you're doing what you would do, then it's pretty easy to know what you would do. But I try to skew it more toward what I think the committee will do and how they will treat some of these teams. Because as an example, like in Ohio State, I think because of D'Angelo Russell and they look like they should be, they look like a good team at times and good track record, which I know shouldn't factor into it, but it's hard not to. Their resume in and of itself is not really that great. They're 1-6 against the top 50. Now, what they really have going for them is they don't, they lost at Michigan, but other than that, I mean, they've lost to all their games to teams that are either safely in the tournament or at the very least in the conversation. So, they're a team that looks pretty good. They have really good Pomeroy numbers and things like that. It's just the resume is less inspiring than than you'd like it to be. So I had them probably, if it was where I would put them, I'd probably have them as a 10. I think even trying to predict the committee, I had them kind of right on that edge of the 9-10 range. But I think they're a good example of that, where I think they get a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. When compared to some of these other teams, all of whom in that range tweeted this last night. Once you get to like the last 7 seed and then the 8s, 9s, and 10s, it's just kind of a mess. You can talk yourself into or out of virtually anybody, and to me, I think they're a team committee might be more apt to be able to talk themselves into than out of.
Okay, well, you basically started answering my second question, which is, who are some teams as you're going through this that you're finding you feel a little bit better than you think they'll be seeded, and maybe other teams that you feel worse about than you think they'll be seeded? So basically trying to identify which teams will underperform and outperform their seeds. Are there any that really jump out especially?
If you look at, there's not a ton at the top. I mean, I feel like one that I'm a little bit lower on than others is Utah, and I think they're a really good team. It's definitely one of those cases where it doesn't really reflect what I think about them, but the reality is at this point that they've beaten Wichita State at home in overtime, and other than that, their best wins are against BYU, UCLA, and Stanford, all of whom are just inside or just outside of the field. And so, at some point, how do you reconcile that with who you've beaten, how good seems like you ought to be, and they just lost to Washington over the weekend. So they're one that I feel like I end up being a lot of times a bit lower on, perhaps than others. Trying to just kind of scroll through here and look. Boise State, Oklahoma State are a couple that I might be, a seed line higher on than some others. Xavier might be a good one. I think I had them as an 8, and I'm trying to remember where they were on the bracket matrix. But they're kind of they're an odd case where they've got some bad losses, but they've also got some, a number of good wins. So they've got 4 top 25 wins. They've also lost 3 games outside the top 100. So the same team that's beaten, that swept Georgetown and won at Cincinnati and beat Butler has lost to UTEP, Long Beach State, Auburn, DePaul, and Creighton. So, a team like that is a little bit hard to figure out where they're this, Jekyll and Hyde scenario. LSU, I mentioned when I was, working on the bracket last night, they're another one that's in that same boat. Those are the ones that I struggle with the most, it feels like. And I don't know whether I end up being higher or lower, but I tend to give a little bit more credit to teams like that where I skew more toward, well, you've at least shown you can beat people, versus some of these other teams who have had a lot of cracks at beating good teams and haven't been able to do it. Now, you don't want to see them drop games to some of the people they've dropped games to. But again, if you've proven on more than one occasion that you've been able to beat good teams, then I tend to give a little bit more credit to that. But it's all relative. Some of the SEC teams are kind of interesting as well, as you look at teams like Georgia, who really hasn't done very much. Mississippi is out there; they're in a similar boat, and Texas A&M is kind of on the outside looking in. They don't have any top 50 wins, but they don't really have any terrible losses. They end up with 9 top 100 wins just because they really beat up on teams in the 51 to 100 range. So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but those are some of the ones that are harder for me to gauge whether I'm doing good or bad on, because That's the part where it definitely comes into more of what this particular committee might value above what some of the others in the past have.
Last question about bracketology stuff before we move into talking IU-Northwestern is Iowa and Maryland. How high up? Right now you have Maryland as a 3, I believe, and Iowa as a 7. How high could they jump if they were to make a run in the Big Ten tournament, do you think?
Maryland is interesting. They're on the 3 line. That we talked a little bit earlier about how the top 8 feel like they've been locked in for a couple weeks now, probably even longer than that, quite honestly. So I think they're a team that they need some things in front of them to break right. So they need Kansas to potentially lose an early game, and the committee to factor in. They may not have Cliff Alexander. Perry Ellis has been hurt for them. So they're lacking front court players, and at their current strength, there might be some question there if they go out early. Gonzaga loses tonight to BYU, and all of a sudden, they've lost twice to that team in the last couple weeks, and because of the conference they play in, they just don't have the top end wins to compete. So that there's maybe a chance that they could get onto the 2 line. I think they'd probably have to get to the final to do that, and maybe even have to win it and beat Wisconsin to do it. But they've got a pretty solid resume. They're 5-3 against the top 50 and 10-5 against the top 100. And really don't have, their worst loss of their 5, I guess you'd say, is at Illinois. But other than that, losing at IU, at Ohio State, at Iowa, and to Virginia at home. So they don't have any bad losses. Swept Michigan State and beat Wisconsin at home. So and they got out of conference wins against Iowa State and Oklahoma State. So I think they could potentially get to the 2 line, but I think they have to play really well in the Big Ten tournament. Which would probably not be great news for IU fans if they did, and need some things in front of them to break right. Iowa has really played better of late. You look at that last 10 games, they're 8-2. Now their schedule got quite a bit easier, but they're a team that they've got some really good road wins. They won at North Carolina, they swept Ohio State, so they won there. Winning at IU. They've got they lost at Northwestern in overtime in the game that they probably should have lost in regulation, quite honestly. The Syracuse loss doesn't look as good now as it probably did then. They lost to Minnesota at home, kind of when they were really struggling. But they've played better of late. They've got 4 top 50 wins, a couple top 25 wins. I would say, for them, maybe they could get to the 5 range, but again, that probably entails certainly beating Purdue and probably beating Wisconsin. I don't know that they'll fall very far if they, even losing to Purdue. I don't know that hurts them a ton, but they've got kind of an odd resume where there's some really good highs and some really head-scratching losses. So they're in that, again, another Jekyll and Hyde team. I think I read about those at one point over the season where you look at some of these wins and you're like, nobody who beat these teams should have lost to these other teams that they lost to. So they're a little bit tougher to figure out. I think their ability to move up is probably tempered a bit by some of the losses.
All right. Excellent job breaking down the bracket. Do you have any final thoughts before we move on?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we talked about this. I guess just a quick plug for the site. I mean, we'll be doing updates throughout the week, at least every couple days, to see how things are starting to shake out. There's 4 automatic bids tonight, just 1 tomorrow, and then there's, I think, 14 on Saturday. So there's still a lot of movement, especially once the major conference tournaments get into full swing. And I think that these teams that are right around the bubble are, in some cases, bad enough where you could still see a decent amount of movement. So it should be pretty interesting handful of days, and a lot of teams, a lot of good debate that probably won't really know the right answer to until Sunday evening.
Yep. You can follow Andy on Twitter at AndyBottoms, and then assemblycall.com/bracketology is where the new updated bracket is posted whenever Andy has one, and of course we'll tweet it out from the Assembly Call account too. All right, let's turn our attention now to IU-Northwestern, because all of this Indiana bubble talk is moot if the Hoosiers lose to Northwestern. So to provide a quick overview to frame our discussion of this game, neither one of these teams is especially hot right now. Since Indiana and Northwestern played, the Hoosiers have dropped 2 straight home games, and Northwestern has lost 2 out of 3. But if you expand that a little bit, Northwestern finished the season winning 5 out of their last 7 games, and Indiana, as we know, dropped 8 of their last 12. So certainly Northwestern has been playing better than Indiana coming into this game. Now, KenPom currently has Indiana favored by 5. predicting a 73-68 win with a 68% chance of an IU victory. Ken Palm also had Indiana slated to win its last 6 games, and we saw how that turned out, so take that prediction as you will. Andy, there are 2 things, listening to Tom Crean's show last night, there are 2 things he said. One encouraged me, one discouraged me. The thing he said that encouraged me was that they're considering picking up more full court, basically applying a little bit more defensive pressure, kind of trying something new, because certainly Indiana had success against it late against Northwestern. They had success against Michigan State doing it late in the game, and he seemed open to the idea of doing it a little bit more. Now, he kind of hemmed and hawed for why Indiana hasn't done it that much all season. None of his answers really made much sense to me, but I was at least encouraged to know that he's thinking about doing it on Thursday, because when our defense has been just so bad and really we do nothing well, why not try something different? Now, here's what he said that discouraged me, which is that the Hoosiers are dealing with some injuries, and probably not unlike a lot of teams at this point in the season, but that was one of the reasons that he cited for not pressing much and not picking up so much full court during the season, is just a lack of depth and injury concerns, that kind of thing. You think about it, Hunter is obviously, he was hurt earlier this year. We don't know if he's 100%. Colin Hartman appears to finally be rounding into shape, but he hasn't been 100% all year, and certainly he's not now. We know Robert Johnson has been hampered since he took that spill at Ohio State. I don't think he's 100%. James Blackman Jr. was limping around some against Michigan State. So this is a team that is a little bit hobbled, and we know that they don't exactly taper down the practices too much, so they may not be the freshest team, although you sure hope that maybe they've practiced a little bit less intently and have some fresh legs. So those 2 elements are somewhat conflicting, and so I don't think we really know if Indiana is going to pick up as much full court as we want, because we don't know how healthy they are. So I think it would be interesting if they do. We'll have to kind of see. So, I go into this game having confidence simply because we know that we're the more talented team than Northwestern. But the question is, as we saw in the game at Northwestern, when we let the other team take us out of what we want to do, especially on defense like they did in the second half, and make us settle offensively, this team has to rely on making shots to win. And away from Assembly Hall, that has been a recipe for disaster this year. And even the last 3 games in Assembly Hall, that has been a recipe for disaster. So it's really tough to know what to expect. I tend to think that over 40 minutes in basketball games, most of the time talent wins out, and that's what gives me confidence that Indiana can win. But without some kind of change on defense, you have to be a little bit wary. So as we go into the game, that's what I think. I do think Indiana's going to win, but I definitely don't think it's a lock, as some people have tweeted me, especially since this team already beat us once this year. But how are you feeling? Are you feeling confident, and what do you think Indiana needs to do differently this game to have a different result than what we saw in Evanston?
Yeah, so I did a couple things today. One was just to look at how these teams have done over the course of the Big Ten season in its entirety, from both the points per possession and just general possession standpoint and things like that. So I'll touch on that in a second. The first thing, I did look back a little bit. You asked if one of Ryan or I wanted to rewatch the game and do that, which I thought was, I don't know why you'd ask anyone to do that. I thought we were friends, but apparently we're not as close as I thought. But I did look back at least some of the stats from the game, which was all probably a third as painful as watching it over the course of the whole game again. But look, some of the numbers that stand out for Northwestern. They shot 40% from three-point range. They shot almost 60% on twos. They had assists on 20 out of 25 made baskets, and they ended up with 9 offensive rebounds, which is about a 33% rate. At least that's what I jotted down. Now, when you look at IU, on the flip side of that, they actually had 17 assists on 23 makes, which is pretty good. 16 offensive rebounds, which is a really strong performance. Although part of that was because they missed so many shots. There were so many opportunities. But 31 of 63 shot attempts came from three-point range, which is a bit of what Northwestern wants you to do. IU missed a lot of free throws, only had 4 turnovers. So you look at some of those things, and it's like, well, what if those are really sustainable? I think IU definitely can't fall in love with the three in the same way that they did in that game, because Troy was the only guy on the team that had more than 4 2-point attempts, which I think is pretty astounding given the number of guys that played to have just one guy shoot over 4 2-pointers. He had a really good game. So I think you take some of those pieces and then try to figure out how to how to tighten things up a bit defensively, work to get inside a bit more. And I think that was a game, if I remember, where the missed free throws started to pile up, and it seemed like IU shied away from going inside and going into contact. They got in a bonus pretty early in the half, and then really got away from some of those things. As you look at keys to the game, so a couple numbers stick out when you look at either team. So I'll take Northwestern first. And this first one at least speaks to the importance of really speeding up the pace and increasing the number of possessions, and speaks to how they want to play. So they've had 8 games in the Big Ten, so this is 8 out of the 18, where they had over 60 possessions, and they were 2-6 in those games. And one of those was a double overtime game, at which they barely got over the 60 mark as well. No, I guess that's not true. So they really want to slow it down. They, when their opponent scores over 66 points, they're 1-10 in Big Ten play. So if you start to think about, magic numbers for IU, it's you want to, get up and down the court a little bit, get into the, at least 60-plus possession range and score over 66 points, and you feel like you should have a fairly good chance to win, again, with a reasonable defensive performance, which, as we all know, feels like it might be a lot to expect in this case. So those are kind of a couple of numbers to watch, and again, really speaks to the importance of speeding that up. Northwestern, when their opponents score over 1.1 points per possession, that's happened 12 times. They're 2-10. So definitely have to be efficient offensively. I think part of that comes from shot selection, as we kind of fell into the trap, it felt like, in the last game, where just fell in love with the 3 and rode it out from there. When you look at IU, similarly, over 65 possessions, IU 6-3. So again, you want to try to to get that pace up. That 65 is right around what IU's average was in Big Ten play, it looks like. So you had that, and interestingly enough, the other game against Northwestern is the only time in Big Ten play that IU had a game with under 60 possessions. So again, really speaks to Northwestern controlled the tempo, have to be able to get away from that at this point. And so we talked earlier about, Northwestern, they gave up over 66 points. That's a big deal. For IU, scoring at least 69 points is a big deal. 9-3 in Big Ten play when scoring at least 69 points. 0-6 when they don't. So, there has to be, those are some of the key numbers to me. Obviously, if you score 69 points and play defense like IU has in some of these other games, that may not be enough to win, but at least the percentages are in your favor at that point. So I would like to think that we do see a bit more of the press. And again, I think, as you and Ryan talked about in the postgame show against Michigan State, it isn't necessarily something that this team can or should do all the time. But I think we'd much rather see that as a way to vary the defense than we would go into the zone, the much maligned zone, as we think about it that way. So I think the big thing for me in this is just pace, over and over again, pace. Getting up and down the floor, getting the game at IU's tempo, and I think that one way to do that is certainly pressing a bit. And Northwestern has been prone in some of these games to have a lot of turnovers, and even when IU turned up the pressure late in that game, I don't think they had a lot of turnovers for the game, but they had a lot in that late game scenario. So I think you really have to do that, and unfortunately, doing that for a long period of time in a tournament scenario may not really be sustainable. But it's also a case where you don't have a lot to lose at this point, and you got to fire whatever bullets you have in the gun, I would say, based on wherever IU is, now when it comes to tournament play and that kind of thing. So I think that's going to be key, and how they come out and handle that part of it is going to go a long way toward deciding whether they can win or not.
And if we look at individuals who will be important, clearly Troy Williams is going to be huge. I mean, he had 21 points and 14 boards in that first game, and really there at the end of the second half, he was kind of keeping Indiana in it almost, the one guy who brought some energy after that huge drought that Indiana had. And Nick Zeisloft is another guy who's been playing pretty well. And we've got like 3 questions on the same topic. So let me ask you this, which is, and let me preface this by saying Nick Zeisloft right now is on one of the most spectacular runs of first-half shooting I think I've ever seen. Like we talked about on the post-game show after Michigan State. I'm pretty sure the only three-pointer he's missed in the last 4 games was slammed home by Hunter Mosquera-Perea in the most Tom Pritchard-esque follow-up dunk that we've seen in years. And so Zeisloft has really been playing well in the first half. He's cooled off some in the second half. With the way he's been playing, Andy, would you give him a start in this game? I mean, clearly he's earned it with the way he's played. It's not like anybody else is playing defense, so we're not really going to, I guess, grade against him on that end of the floor. But is that the kind of thing that you do in the Big Ten tournament, or do you kind of say, hey, whatever we're doing with him is working, so maybe he's better sitting for the first 5 or 6 minutes, coming in, providing a spark with threes? Me personally, I tend toward a guy's playing well in a particular role, I would leave him there myself, maybe get him in a little bit sooner, but I would leave him coming off the bench because some guys just function better that way. What would you do with Zeiss left?
Yeah, I tend to err a bit more on the side of your line of thinking here, and I think we've seen. I'm trying to look up the minutes here real quick. I mean, he's been playing a good number of minutes as we've gotten into these, these other games where upwards of 20 minutes or more at least in the last 4 games. So he's still playing a decent amount, and I wouldn't mind seeing even those minutes tick up a bit. But I do think he's, from a shooting perspective, that seems to be, working well for him to come into the game in that scenario. So I think that, definitely is an area where I'd probably keep him in it as well. If you want to come out, as we kind of go back to the last question and think about pressing, if you want to come out and try to speed the game up early, he might not be. And I know, as you said, defensively, it's hard to pick who from this team is really any better or worse than another. But certainly when you think about it, Robert Johnson playing is one of the guys I know that's been thrown out of, do you bring him off the bench? He's still one of the better defenders on the team. And so, do you leave him out there early to set the tone and do some of those things where you hope to get on a good roll defensively early, maybe speed the game and put the press, and then bring Zeiss in after that? I definitely would. I'd say more than whether he starts or comes off the bench, I'd like to see him probably get a little bit closer to 30 minutes based on the way that he's been playing. But I guess to me, it maybe is a bit less important how he ends up at that number. But I think particularly against a team that is going to play zone, wants to force opponents to shoot threes, as they really have over the course of the Big Ten season. I mean, opponents are taking 40% of their field goal attempts from three-point range against Northwestern. I think that's the most of anybody, and by the same token, and not surprisingly at all, IU takes 41% of theirs from beyond the arc. So it's going to be a game where, while you don't want the ratio of threes to twos to be about 50-50 as it was last time these two teams played, there's going to be opportunities to shoot three-pointers. And I think that means, Zeiss, as you said, is as hot as anybody right now and needs to be out there quite a bit.
Our buddy J-Hub asks, is it time for Yogi to channel last season and look to carry us, or will improved D open things up for the way we play O? There's a lot to unpack there, because first of all, the supposition of improved D, that just seems like such a ridiculous premise based on the season.
There's a lot of room to get better. There's a lot of room to get better. We can't argue that.
That's true. I mean, just a slight tick up. A tick up from atrocious to merely awful would actually be perhaps enough of an improvement to get this team into the weekend of the Big Ten tournament. So, I mean, look, if we play improved D, I think this team's going to win 2 games. I mean, that's what we need, is somehow to play a little bit of improved D. What I think is the more interesting part of that question is the first one. Is it time for Yogi to channel last year and look to carry us? As we were going through the Michigan State game, I found myself in the first half thinking, all right, Yogi, maybe this is a time where you need to not be quite so patient, because he's really struck that balance this year of being patient early in games, trying to get guys involved, and taking over more in the second half. And I found myself thinking that in the Michigan State game, maybe try and take over a little bit earlier. But in hindsight, I think the way that he went about it was perfectly fine. I mean, he ended up having a really good game against Michigan State, and he put the team on his back in the second half there when we needed him to. And I mean, look, it wasn't his fault that we end up losing that game by 2. Troy shows up. If a lot of other things happen, it's a different ballgame. So, personally, I think Yogi needs to play this game in this Big Ten tournament exactly as he's been playing. Because, frankly, if we don't have James Blackman Jr. making shots, if we don't get Troy involved in the game early so he's active the whole time, if we don't get Hunter Mosquera-Perea active and engaged early on, if maybe we don't get Colin Hartman a couple open threes to get him going a little bit, it's not going to matter if Yogi scores 25 points. It's going to feel just like last year, and we're going to lose. So I have to kind of fight myself sometimes wishing Yogi would take over a little bit more, but I think it's in this team's best interest for him to do what he's been doing, which is be really patient early, really work to get other guys involved, and then work for his shots later in the game, maybe when the offense stalls, or if it's a close 1 or 2 possession game and we need a guy to just go get a shot in the half court. What do you think about Yogi's role in this Big Ten tournament?
Yeah, I mean, we're not being too controversial, agreeing with each other a lot, but I tend to fall in the same camp. I think it's a lot easier if you think about the two alternatives. One is, try to take over early and then get other guys involved later. I feel like that's harder to do than getting them involved early and then being able to, pick your spots as the game goes on and try to take over then. And the plus side of the approach he's been taking is, we have seen, Hunter, make a couple, baskets in the post. We've seen Zaislov get involved. He's great at trying to create shots for Troy, which those two played really well together in the first game against Northwestern. So I think that's really important to get other guys going, especially because one of the things I keep coming back to, and I thought of this when listening to you and Ryan do the post game show for Michigan State after the fact, is like there's just a certain level of fragility around this team right now, and I think one way to hopefully bolster confidence of some of these guys is to get them involved early, see a couple shots go in, and get them rolling from there. And if that doesn't happen, then by all means take over. But I think when you've got guys that seem to be fairly fragile and are lacking some confidence right now, I'm not sure that going away from them early in the game is really the best thing for the team. And when you look at his, I'm just looking at his game log on Pomeroy. The Iowa game, he had a 83 O rating, but prior to that, and including the Michigan State game, that's six of the last 7 games with an offensive rating of at least 120, which is really good, obviously. And so I think when you look at things like that, he's able to influence the game. He's got 4, 5, 6 assists in nearly every one of those games. Again, the Iowa one is the only exception to that. And so I think he's found some good things to do there. The one area that I would, I guess, encourage, and the thing that he did really well is he really led the comeback against Michigan State was getting to the line a lot. Obviously, with the way the final free throw he shot, it's kind of a touchy subject for a lot of us, I know, but he got to the line 12 times in that game. And as I mentioned before, in that Northwestern game, the first one, IU got into the bonus early and really went away from that. He only shot 1 free throw in that game, and I think it's important that again, in the interest of not relying on three-pointers, that he continue to be aggressive to try to either get into the zone off of fast break, off of the half court, or get to the rim in fast break scenarios and things like that, because he has shown the ability to be able to finish, through some contact there. And Northwestern doesn't have, elite shot blockers by any means. So I do think that's one area where if he's going to force the issue early, that's what I'd like to see it be. Potentially getting a guy like Trey Dempsey into a little bit of foul trouble, who, has been a thorn in IU's side for the last couple of seasons. Can you do some of those things, get guys to the line? I think that's the one area, if there was a place that I'd say I'd like him to be more aggressive early, that would probably be it. But otherwise, I think his approach these last few games, while the results, in the win and loss column haven't reflected it, I don't think that's a result of his play necessarily. So, and again, I think based on the way these guys are, and confidence is not at a premium by any means, I think to give guys a chance to get involved early and see the ball go through the basket is going to be pretty important.
God, when you look at the box score of the first Indiana-Northwestern game, do you realize, well, I'm sure you realize this, but to everyone listening, do you realize that we almost shot better from three-point range than we did from the free throw line and from two-pointers? In that game, Indiana shot 38.7% from three. We only shot 34.4% on twos, and we shot 43.8% on free throws. I mean, that is absurd. And we jumped on Tom Crean a little bit for saying, well, we just missed shots, because I think that was such an oversimplification of why we lost that game. But we did miss some shots. I mean, and if some of those shots fall, especially some of the shots that were in close, that would certainly help. And I think just the law of averages of maybe some of the good shots Indiana got, both from the line and inside, just some of those going in at a normal rate will help the Hoosiers at least gain some confidence, which is really what this team needs. All right, we're about an hour into the show, which means we're going to wrap up soon, and that means it's now safe for me to ask a question about Stanford Robinson, which I'm going to do. So let me ask you this question, Andy, and I realize that I may end up losing all my credibility as an analyst for defending Stan Robinson as much as I have, but I simply think that on a team that's so bad defensively, and with him really being the best on-ball defender we have, the more I look at it in hindsight, and I start to think about lineups he's played with, and this is why I want to ask you this question, I really feel like he's been underutilized and almost put in a position to fail, which he has done a lot of times, granted. And here's what I mean by that, is I feel like a lot of times he ends up coming in when Yogi comes out and takes on a primary ball handling role, which he is not suited for because Stanford simply hasn't grasped yet that he I realize he can get to the basket anytime he wants, but he can't do anything once he's there. And the only times he's really had success this season is when he's driven to pass, but unfortunately most times he drives and tries to shoot, and it just becomes an empty possession. And it completely negates some of the good things he's done on the other side of the floor. Now, especially if you start talking about Indiana picking up more full court and trying to add defensive pressure, you can't look toward that kind of strategy, which a lot of Indiana fans have, and not figure that Stan Robinson's going to play into it, because he is, along with Yogi, when Yogi is really engaged defensively, Stan is the best guy we have at putting pressure on opposing ball handlers and even doing playing a denial role on defense. And he's done it well at times this year. I know you don't have these numbers in front of you, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot. But as you've looked at different lineups, doesn't it seem to you like Stan a lot of times has been, instead of being put in maybe when Yogi is playing and Zeisloft is in and Troy's out there, so he's somewhat protected on offense and can almost be hidden, it seems like he gets put in to where he's got to play a primary role on offense. And he ends up initiating the offense a lot of times, which just, it makes me want to bang my head against the wall. And I think a big part of why he struggled this year is his simple inability to mature on the offensive end and try and do too much. That goes on him. But I do not think that the coaches have helped him by the lineup composition and by what they've asked him to do on offense. It's almost like they're more stubborn than I am that he can be a productive player because they keep putting him in a position to have the ball in his hands, and I think his value is so much better on defense. And now I'll, as I usually do with these questions, am I insane, or do you think that I have a point here?
I wish I had, I've done the lineup stuff all season, but I haven't been very good about keeping up. For a while, I've been putting them all into a, kind of one list so that, I could look at them all at the same time. So I don't know exactly when the last time I did that was, so I'm a little bit flying blind here as to when that was. But at least at that point, the last point that I updated this, the top two lineups that I can see that he was a part of did not include Yogi. So here's what they were. Now, again, this probably does not include a lot of the more recent games, but I think it's probably fair. The first one was Blackman, Hartman, Holt, and Zeisloft. So, again, he definitely becomes a primary ball handler in that. Blackman certainly brought the ball up the floor at times, but, certainly Zeisloft, not a guy we've seen bring the ball up the court quite a bit. And the other, Hartman, Johnson, Perea, Robinson, and Zeisloft. So Hartman and Zeisloft were part of both of those. You had a big guy in Perea and Holt. And then you had Johnson kind of swapped out for Blackman and the others, where, again, in those scenarios, it's probably a 50-50 case if he and Johnson, sharing the ball handling duties. So might be something I can look at later and dump some of this all together and look at it that way. But I do think it's a fair point. I think that, you and I collectively I feel like have taken up for him probably more than anyone could have or should have at this point. But there are definitely those times when you watch him play and he seems to fall into the role that you can envision for him, and you can see where he could be a valuable member of the team. I think to me it's almost a difference between valuable and productive. I think everybody looks at productive in terms of are you going to score a lot of points, and he's a guy who hasn't scored more than 4 points in a couple of months. I think as I kind of glance through his his stat line, and he scored 12 points against Penn State in mid-January. So we're going on not quite 2 months where he has scored more than 4 points once. But I don't think that's what he needs to do. And again, there are times when I don't think he has a good understanding that that's not what he needs to do. But certainly if IU's going to, if the injuries are a factor, as you mentioned, and they do want to press, he certainly feels like a guy with his length and, creating deflections. Just had to throw that in there. That he can be an integral part of that. And if it can create, fast break opportunities, I trust him much more in those kinds of scenarios than a half-court one where he's going to get himself in a position where he thinks he needs to drive the lane and ends up throwing up a wild shot or driving into a blocked shot, as I think he did a couple times in the Northwestern game. He was 0 for 3 in that game, and I seem to recall a couple pretty ugly shots, as that game went along. So, I think it's a case of, I feel like we talked about this with him a lot. It's and other guys at this, we've mentioned this before as well. I think with him, it's more apparent than anyone else. Is like understand what you're doing when you're playing well and you're being a valuable member of the team. And I think he struggles with that at times. But perhaps if IU goes to that press and really tries to get him involved from that standpoint, then perhaps that's a something he can build off of. But I do think if they want to press, they're going to have to much to the chagrin of everyone, go deeper into the bench and play he and Hotzel maybe a few more minutes if they want to do it for any length of time, because you are going to have to rest guys, particularly in a tournament scenario. It's naive to think that you wouldn't, but can you get in a few minute spurt, have him come in and play 3 sets of 4 minutes really hard, where he really tries to create some havoc out there defensively? That absolutely can be valuable to this team that has struggled so much one-on-one defensively. And that's another case where do you get away from the zone as you move forward? And if you do, at certain points in the game, whether that's getting closer to crunch time or you just need key stops, you need somebody who can be that go-to defender. And he seems to fit the bill from a skill set standpoint of that. It's just that the results don't necessarily translate onto the court. And I feel like with him, in most cases, you can watch him play for 2 or 3 minutes and you have a fairly good idea of whether he's going to give you very much good in that given game. And if you need to go away from him, you go away from him. But if he's in the game for a couple minutes and ends up throwing up a wild shot, you have a pretty good idea of what you're going to get from him. Versus if he's in the game and tries to move the ball a bit more and plays more of that role, then I think you can start to feel at least as comfortable as you can with him on the floor.
Yeah, he just seems like a guy at some point, just tell him, hey, don't shoot. Because when you look at his numbers, I mean, he's second on the team in assist rate at 18.1. He's first on the team in steal percentage. The percentage of possessions he's used has gone down, so he's at least not hogging the ball quite as much when he gets in there. But his shooting percentages are just so bad. But it's one of those things. Again, Indiana always wants to play through the lane. Who's better at getting into the lane than Stanford? Not many people. So if he just goes in there looking to pass and doesn't even think about shooting, because even when people play off of him, force him to shoot, he finds his way in there, and then he can focus on the defense. It's bothered me all year because he has a unique skill, I think, in his defensive ability and his willingness to get down and dirty on defense that a lot of our guys haven't shown. And I feel like he's failed himself and the coaches have failed him because he really could have been a productive player on this team and possibly a difference-making player. If he can come in for 10, 15 minutes a game and play defense like you said, and he improves this team's defense just a tick, that's 1 or 2 more wins possibly, and we're off the bubble. So that's a microcosm of just a thing that's frustrated me, and it's the kind of thing I think you only really get when you watch this team game in, game out. It just it frustrates me because even when he plays with Yogi, I feel like Yogi almost takes a few possessions off to kind of get a rest, and they let Stanford control the ball, and it just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I just wanted to get that off my chest. You can send your your vehement disagreements to Jerod at assemblycall.com because I don't think I get more angry tweets from people than when I try and take up for Stan Robinson. But again, he's been his own worst enemy. Don't get me wrong, but the coaches haven't helped him out. All right, that brings us here near the end of this episode. I feel like we covered most of what we wanted to cover about IU-Northwestern. Ryan was going to give us some scouting reports on Thonmaker and Thomas Bryant, but he was unable to get his computer issues fixed, so he's not here. Neither one of us is probably qualified enough to talk about both those guys, so we'll leave that for another day. But any final thoughts on IU-Northwestern, anything that we haven't covered yet that you think will be a big key in this game?
No, I really think, going back to that, the tempo is going to be important. Obviously, IU shooting the ball well from 3 is going to be important, but to me, it's the balance of where they take the shots and not just they make 3-pointers. I am disappointed that Ryan isn't on. I was going to ask him whether Thonmaker's first name was in any way named after former infielder Dickie Thon, but now I'll never know the answer to that question. So, thanks a lot, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ryan. We really appreciate it, man. All right. Well, with that said, then let's go to some final thoughts. Then, any general final thoughts as we head into the Big Ten tournament, Andy?
Well, I'm excited for it to happen. I think, looking forward to it from a number of perspectives. Obviously, to see if IU can start to right the ship. I think from a draw perspective of the tournament, as you've talked about a number of times, this set up as well as it possibly could for IU when you look at the other teams who are in the got double buys. You can make the argument after Saturday that maybe Michigan State would have been a terrible draw, but I think Wisconsin and Purdue are right at probably number 1 and 2 on the list of teams people didn't want to see. So in that regard, things seem at least as favorable as they can be if IU is going to make a run and squelch any talk of missing the tournament. So to me, that all starts on Thursday. I think it's a game that there's really no excuse to lose at this point. To lose to Northwestern twice over your last 4 games of the season, I think it's not too hard to argue that you probably don't deserve to make the tournament if you do that. Obviously, no offense to Northwestern intended there, but I do think that if you're really a tournament caliber team, you can't close the season out that way. So, feels like a similar refrain for us over the course of the season. We've had a lot of the same concerns, a lot of the same questions, but here's a chance to answer some of those and show that us against the world mentality that got kind of thrown out that I don't feel like we saw a lot of on Saturday. So go out, play basketball, have some fun, get the pace going, make some threes, and get to the Maryland game. And at that point, I think anything can happen. I think if there's any team that IU is going to have confidence against, it's going to be Maryland. That was a game that when you really look back at some of these losses, I felt like that was the one that they fought the most in and that they lost, that they deserved the most to win. And I'm sure those guys feel that way as well. So I think if they can get to that matchup, it's one they should have some confidence in. Hopefully at least a good showing there and get them back into the tournament. So for as frustrating as this team has been to watch, I guess I'm not ready to be done watching them play. We'll see how Thursday goes, and maybe I'll change my tune, but definitely hoping for a win against Northwestern so we can see a bit more of these guys get into the NCAA tournament and see where things go from there.
Yeah, I mean, look, if this team loses Thursday, I think we'll all be ready for the season to come to a close because there's no way that ends well if that is a loss. And then if they win, you look at it, and it's Maryland sitting there, and Indiana has outplayed Maryland over 80 minutes. Indiana's plus 17 against Maryland, and one Yogi three-pointer away that looked good from winning that game. So I think as fans we'd have confidence, the players would have confidence. So I think as we look at this game on Thursday, if you drew a pro-con list of why Indiana's going to win, why they're going to lose, it would be pretty even on both sides. Maybe even you have more on the con side with the way this team has collapsed at the end of the season. But there's always 2 ways to look at it, and so why not focus on the positives heading into Thursday? And that's what I'm choosing to do. And I actually think that Indiana being away from home but not being on an opponent's floor, playing at a neutral court, can help them. I mean, they had success already at a neutral court, beating Butler. I think some storm clouds have been forming over Assembly Hall in Bloomington, a lot of pressure, the booing, that maybe Assembly Hall hasn't exactly been the friendly confines of Assembly Hall recently, and pressure seems to have taken over a little bit. You could almost see the weight of those free throws weighing on Yogi at the end of that game against Michigan State, and he didn't shoot them like he normally did. And so I just wonder if maybe, okay, the regular season's done, we lost all these games, but it's like a fresh start, and we've got a chance against Northwestern. I know this team has to look at that Northwestern game and see missed opportunities and say, my God, we didn't score for 10 minutes. If we just make a few shots, we can win this. And then Maryland, it's setting up for Indiana to make a run. It's all right there. And so the question is, can this team do it? And we've talked a lot on the post-game show that we feel like this team might have a postseason run in them because of the way they can shoot, because of the guard play. Well, the postseason's here, so let's do it. And we're going to see, none of the talk is going to matter Thursday at 6:30. All that'll matter is what's on the court. But I think as fans, there's plenty of reason to have some optimism heading into this because there's 2 winnable games for Indiana. If the Hoosiers win them, I think we can feel pretty good that we're in the tournament, and then you take the chances in the tournament. And if you get some good matchups, who knows, maybe you still have a positive end to this season. So I don't know about you. For me, that's what I'm going to choose to focus on for the next 48 hours because I think it's reasonable and because it makes my fan experience just more enjoyable. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it, and I hope for you that some of the things we've talked about tonight, some of the things that Alex and I talked about on the last episode of Podcast on the Brink, lend a little perspective, hopefully add a little bit of optimism, and who knows, let's all rally around this team. Let's hope they've got one final gasp in them because the talent is there to make a run. Now it's all up to them to go out there and do it. And I, for one, can't wait to see if they do it on Thursday night. I think they will. We will see. Thank you to everybody who watched us live tonight. We really appreciate it. To everybody who listened on Podcast on the Brink, we very much appreciate that too. If you have not joined our email list, assemblycall.com/subscribe, please make sure you get on that. We send out subscriber-only analysis the day after every game, and this year we'll be doing some more in the off-season, doing some roundups of recruiting news and different stuff to kind of keep you up to date on IU basketball, because I know it's a little bit harder to keep track of everything in the off-season, so we will help you do that whenever the off-season is, but of course, hopefully there's many, many weeks before we'll be getting to the off-season email. So again, thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you on Thursday night after IU-Northwestern, assemblycall.com/live. Talk to you then, everybody.